Thank you, Richard, for the nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be on this beautiful campus. I appreciate everybody's hospitality, and it's a real honor to be part of this Civil War Reconsidered lecture series. As you know, the Civil War was the most momentous struggle in American history, both in its physical magnitude and in its impact on the character of this country. I am not, though, going to talk about the war this afternoon. Instead, I'm going to talk about the war's causes. In particular, as Richard said, I'm going to discuss the role of slavery's most determined opponents, the abolitionists. Nearly all historians writing today about the sectional conflict agree that slavery was the root cause of the Civil War. By clinging to human bondage as a labor system and means by which white people controlled black people, the South set itself apart. This produced a series of events that led to secession and war. Does that mean that the war could not have been avoided? That the war would have come in 1861 or thereabouts no matter what? Do individuals fool themselves when they think they can influence the direction of events? During the 19th century, historians held that certain individuals could exert such influence. The 19th century historians believed in what they called great men who shaped the course of events. Among such great men were Genghis Khan, Napoleon, George Washington. Historians no longer believe this. Today we emphasize impersonal forces. Among them are economics, ideology, culture, religion, means of production, politics, and other forces beyond individual control. We no longer believe that one individual, no matter how powerful, can by herself or himself shape history. But what about groups, especially radical groups like the American abolitionists? Given an underlying conflict, can such groups push events toward a resolution? Or are their efforts insignificant compared to broader forces? Beginning during the 1700s, abolitionists called for ending slavery. At the time, slavery existed throughout what became the 13 states. Slavery was less central as a labor and social system in the Northeast than it was in the South. And most 18th century abolitionists lived in the Northeast, where by 1804 they had achieved success in each of that region's states. But even in the Northeast, ending slavery was not an easy task. This is because even in the Northeast, abolition threatened to change the existing racial and economic order. Even in the Northeast, a large minority regarded those who advocated ending slavery to be fanatical troublemakers. There are several things to keep in mind regarding the abolitionists. First, American abolitionism was part of a wider movement that affected the entire Atlantic world. So abolitionism can be understood as an impersonal force resting on a variety of material factors. Second, by the late 1820s, American abolitionism had become even more radical as it sought to end slavery in the South. Prior to that time, abolitionists usually called for gradually ending slavery. Usually white abolitionists did not emphasize equal rights for African Americans. But by the 1820s, African Americans in the North and in the border slave states began to call for the immediate abolition of slavery, and they called for racial justice. Together with a religious revival and the leadership of William Lloyd Garrison, a white abolitionist from Massachusetts, they changed abolitionism in a manner that alarmed Southerners, white Southerners. Garrison initiated his weekly newspaper, The Liberator, in January 1831. The following August, Nat Turner led a slave rebellion in Southern Virginia. This confluence of events caused white Southerners to intensify their already strong defense of what they called their peculiar institution. A third thing to keep in mind is the distinction between the term abolitionism and the term anti-slavery politics. Abolitionists never constituted more than a small minority of Northerners. They aimed to end slavery quickly throughout the United States for the sake of God, in recognition of the slave's humanity, to save the souls of slaveholders, and to save their own souls. In contrast, most anti-slavery politicians and those who voted for those politicians sought only to end the expansion of slavery and the power of slaveholders in the United States government. By the late 1850s, a majority of Northerners supported anti-slavery politics. To a considerable degree, Northern self-interest motivated those Northerners who supported anti-slavery politics. And on the surface, at least, the broader force of anti-slavery politics, not abolitionism, led to secession and civil war. So how did abolitionism and anti-slavery politics relate to each other? And how important is that relationship in evaluating the role of abolitionism in the coming of the Civil War? By 1840, a majority of abolitionists had begun to engage in what is called abolitionist politics. That year, abolitionist leaders formed the Liberty Party. They nominated candidates for state and national office. Liberty abolitionists denounced anti-slavery politicians who belonged to the major parties, the Whig Party and the Democratic Party. Liberty and other abolitionists declared that anti-slavery politicians were misguided. They were just pawns of slaveholders. Abolitionists said such politicians spoke against slavery, but voted for pro-slavery policies and supported slaveholding presidents. Most of the presidents before the Civil War were slaveholders. Later on, abolitionists criticized Republican politicians for not coming up to the high abolitionist standards. Republicans only opposed the expansion of slavery, not the existence of slavery in the South. Yet this can be misleading, this abolitionist denunciation of anti-slavery politicians. Because as early as the 1700s, abolitionists worked with anti-slavery politicians to effect government policy. Abolitionists relied on anti-slavery politicians in Congress to present their petitions calling for ending slavery in the District of Columbia or in the South itself. Abolitionists often praised such politicians and invited them to abolitionist meetings. Pro-slavery leaders, including John C. Calhoun and Jefferson Davis, recognized a close relationship between abolitionism and anti-slavery politicians. So did the major historians of the late 19th century and the early 20th century. In fact, a crucial question regarding the relationship between abolitionists and the coming of the Civil War is what has been the role of historians in presenting this relationship. As you know, some people think history does not change. But historians' interpretations and emphases change over time. In particular, historians' judgments concerning the role of abolitionists in the coming of the Civil War have changed drastically since the 19th century. James Ford Rhodes, the most famous American historian of the late 19th century, utilized the great man theory that I talked about at the start. Rhodes wrote in 1892, quote, "If we wish to estimate correctly the influence of William Lloyd Garrison, we must not stop with the enumeration of his avowed adherents. We must instead picture a process of argument, of discussion, of persuasion, going on for 25 years with an ever-increasing momentum. And we cannot resist the conviction that this abolitionist agitation begun by William Lloyd Garrison had its part, and a great part too, in the first election of Abraham Lincoln to the presidency in 1860. William Lloyd Garrison is a great man in history, and his agitation in the North brings about the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. In 1906, Harvard professor Albert Bushnell Hart modified Rhodes' approach by stressing not so much Garrison as the impact of the entire abolitionist movement. Hart observed, quote, "As time went on, the anti-slavery and abolitionist movements in the North came closer together and sometimes joined forces, partly through the appearance of political abolitionists, and partly by the warming up of the anti-slavery people to the belief that abolition might, after all, be the only way to stop the advance of slavery." In both Rhodes and Hart's interpretations, abolitionists encouraged political opposition to the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. They encouraged the creation of the Republican Party. They encouraged the election of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's election, of course, led to secession, starting in late 1860, the Civil War, beginning in April 1861, the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863, and the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery in 1865. In Rhodes and Hart's view, abolitionists were heroes who set in motion events that ended slavery and created a more perfect union. Abolitionist influence stopped the threat to democracy posed by slaveholders' power in the South and in Washington, D.C. According to a group of historians known as revisionists, part of Rhodes and Hart's analysis made sense, and part of Rhodes and Hart's analysis didn't make sense. Starting shortly after Hart wrote, revisionists challenged the view that abolitionists were heroes who saved the nation by bringing on an essential war. The revisionist Southern backgrounds and racism led them to regard the Civil War as a horrible mistake. Later, the First World War's senseless carnage encouraged their point of view. Slavery, the revisionists contended, was a benevolent institution in which good-natured masters gradually civilized a degenerate black race. The revisionists said if masters had been allowed to achieve their goal, slavery would have disappeared gradually without the death and destruction caused by the Civil War. According to revisionists, the abolitionists, instead of being heroes, were irresponsible fanatics who had brought on a needless war. In other words, revisionists believed the abolitionists were influential, but in a negative rather than a positive way. I want to emphasize that the revisionists, in common with Rhodes, considered abolitionists central to the coming of the Civil War. But this view of the abolitionists' central importance soon came into dispute. During the 1920s, some historians began to question the abolitionists' importance in causing the Civil War. The most famous American historians of the 1920s were Charles and Mary Beard. The Beards emphasized the role of economics in shaping events. They held that Northern economic self-interest alone, by itself, brought about the Civil War. The abolitionists had no place, positive or negative, in the Beards' analysis of the war's causes. During the following decade, another tendency among historians further weakened the contention that abolitionists had an important role in causing the war. This tendency began with fixation on abolitionist motivation. If, as the revisionists claimed, slavery were a benevolent institution, historians asked, well, why did a small number of Northerners so strongly oppose this benevolent institution? If it wasn't slavery itself that made them oppose slavery, because slavery was not hurting anything, why did they oppose it so strongly? In his book, The Anti-Slavery Impulse, historian Gilbert H. Barnes provided an answer. According to Barnes, a religious revival known as the Second Great Awakening caused susceptible Northerners to oppose all manner of sin, including a distant slave system they did not understand. Under Barnes' influence, historians became less interested in the abolitionist role in causing the war and more interested in tracing the abolitionist origins in Northern, not Southern, phenomena. The result has been that since the 1930s, historians have spent enormous energy linking abolitionism to numerous Northern developments. They found the origins of radical abolitionism in a reaction against Northern industrialization, in the displacement of a Northern social elite, and in reliance on the slavery issue by Northerners to seek social control in their own section. Historians also traced abolitionism to anti-institutionalism in the North irrational feelings of guilt brought on by conditions in the North, and coming full circle, values derived from support for Northern industrialism. In other words, historians became obsessed with finding Northern causes for abolitionism. By the 1970s, those who studied abolitionism had turned away from evaluating the movement's role in causing the Civil War. Abolitionist writings became sources for analyzing issues of gender and race in pre-Civil War Northern society, instead of sources for evaluating the abolitionist role in causing the Civil War. Historians of the abolitionist movement became so distracted that one of them declared in 1981, sectional conflict, civil war, and legal emancipation would probably have occurred even if there had been no active abolition movement. This outlook, which is obviously opposite from what started out, this outlook has persisted among historians of abolitionism and has affected historians of the entire Civil War era. But several trends point toward the re-emergence of a more positive assessment of abolitionist influence. This assessment is not just a revival of Rhodes' point of view. It involves a multifaceted approach to understanding the abolitionist role in the coming of the Civil War. And I'm going to state the various topics, and then I'm going to go into a little bit of detail concerning each one of them. First, there is an improved assessment of the role of free African Americans, slaves, and slavery itself in creating abolitionism. Second, there is the role of early abolitionists in creating North-South sectional divisions. Third, there is the realization that major Southern black rebels against slavery were abolitionists. Fourth, there is a better understanding of the abolitionist presence in the border South. Fifth, there is more knowledge about the political impact of abolitionists. And finally, we have a better perception of the impact of the abolitionist increasingly physical assaults on slavery leading up to and including John Brown's raid. In regard to the role of slavery and African Americans, throughout the history of American abolitionism, black abolitionists, white abolitionists, and slaves interacted. In other words, white Northerners did not require special indigenous, religious, economic, or social motivation to become abolitionists. Instead, slavery, slaves, and free African Americans had sufficient impact. Fear of slave revolt had much to do with creating abolitionism during the 18th century. Aid to fugitive slaves and efforts to protect free African Americans from being kidnapped into slavery played a major role in the abolition societies that organized in the Northeast toward the end of the 18th century. Northern economic interests, religion, and revolutionary ideology certainly influenced early abolitionists. But practical, physical, and often violent confrontation with slavery and its victims is what got abolitionism going. And this remained the case as abolitionists became more radical during the 1820s. As historian James Houston pointed out in 1990, it was observing the brutality of slavery and slave renditions rather than Northern economic and cultural developments that led Northerners to become abolitionists. From the start, abolitionists engaged in sectional conflict and threatened the white South. In regard to point number 2, the role of abolitionists in creating the sectional divide, we must also begin in the 18th century. Black and white abolitionists from the 1770s through the 1790s pushed northern states toward either immediate or gradual emancipation within their bounds. If this had not happened, the difference between northern culture and ideology and their southern counterparts would have been less significant. Slave escape would have been more difficult. Pennsylvania acted first when in 1780 it adopted a plan for gradual abolition. Between 1783 and 1804, abolitionist efforts in all the other states of the Northeast achieved a similar goal. Slavery, as I mentioned at the start, had been relatively weak in the North. It may have declined and disappeared without abolitionist intervention in state courts and legislatures. But it would have taken much longer for slavery to disappear. Without abolitionist efforts, slavery would have remained stronger in the North, well into the mid-19th century. If slavery were stronger in the North, the free black communities that nurtured abolitionist activity would have developed more slowly. Just as crucially, gradual abolition in Pennsylvania is what made the Mason-Dixon line a sectional boundary, a demarcation between a region dependent on slave labor and a region dependent on wage labor. As soon as Pennsylvania initiated gradual emancipation, abolitionists challenged slaveholders who entered the state to recapture slaves or who brought slaves into Pennsylvania. Political repercussions from such interference led Congress to pass the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793. Resistance to that law among slaves and abolitionists became a continuing source of North-South tension. In regard to the third point, that dealing with slave revolt, the black men who led the major slave revolts and conspiracies of the 19th century were abolitionists. They were in touch with the emancipationist currents of thought in the Atlantic world. As historian Douglas R. Edgerton has pointed out, revolutionary and religious impulses similar to those that helped Northern abolitionism affected Southern black opponents of slavery. In conjunction with the oppressiveness of slavery, these impulses led Gabriel in 1800, Charles Deslandes in 1811, Denmark Vesey in 1822, and Nat Turner in 1831 to react. Gabriel's plan to capture Richmond, Virginia went awry when two of his associates alerted white authorities. White militia and federal troops overwhelmed Deslandes' march toward New Orleans. Vesey's conspiracy to organize a violent mass escape centered on Charleston, South Carolina, suffered a fate similar to Gabriel's revolt conspiracy. Turner's uprising ended much as had Deslandes'. Even so, these practical black abolitionists frightened white Southerners, who became more committed to slavery as a means of race control. Mass slave escape attempts in Maryland, Kentucky, and Washington, D.C. during the 1840s had a similar impact. So did rumors of a revolt escape conspiracy along the Tennessee-Kentucky border in 1856. In this respect, black abolitionists in the South led slavery's defenders to overreact to Northern abolitionism and anti-slavery politics. The fourth point is the abolitionist presence in the border South. Over the past 15 years, historians have gained an improved understanding of the role of these abolitionists and their impact on secession in the Lower South. Historian William W. Freeling studies the South's progress towards secession. Freeling credits Kentucky abolitionist Cassius Clay with creating by the 1840s an impression that slavery could not long survive in his state and other border South states. Clay, like those like him in Delaware and Maryland and Virginia and Missouri, were an extension of the Northern abolitionist movement. They worked with Northern-based abolitionist churches and anti-slavery societies. They got their funding from these societies. The border slave state abolitionists spread abolitionism all along the north-south boundary and into North Carolina and Tennessee. Their activities and reputations helped push the Lower South into secession and helped keep much of the border South in the Union. In regard to point 5, the abolitionist political impact, it extended from the 18th century into the Civil War. Abolitionist petitions to the first U.S. Congress that convened in New York City in 1789 angered Southern members and forced Northern members to react against them. The petitions called for Congress to abolish the external slave trade and in some cases to abolish slavery itself. More petitions followed during the early 19th century. The result was that in their interaction with politics and government, abolitionists had an early role in creating sectional divisions that worsened over time. In 1819, abolitionists encouraged New York Congressman James Talmadge to propose gradual abolition in Missouri as a condition for its admission to the Union. This caused a sectional crisis and Congress's passage of the Missouri Compromise the following year. A few years later, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society launched a petition campaign against slavery in the District of Columbia. Pennsylvania Congressman Charles Minor, who belonged to the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, introduced legislation to end slavery in the District of Columbia. Minor failed in his effort, but the issue of slavery in the district continued to drive the North and South apart. The great postal campaign that abolitionists began in 1835 broke with their previous strategy. That year, the recently organized American Anti-Slavery Society sent thousands of pieces of anti-slavery propaganda into the South. This caused a sweeping pro-slavery political reaction. But the old abolitionist petitioning tactic continued to have a political role as well. Petitioning led in 1836 to Southern congressmen and their Northern Democratic colleagues passing the Gag Rule. The rule banned reading slavery-related petitions in the House of Representatives. The Gag Rule further divided the country. This was because many non-abolitionist Northerners objected to the rule's violation of the right of petition guaranteed in the Bill of Rights. Finally, abolitionists helped cause the Civil War through physical assaults on slavery. Abolitionists, black and white, helped escaping slaves head north. The escape networks, known collectively by the early 1840s as the Underground Railroad, had existed for generations. The networks proliferated from the late 1830s onward. Historians who disconnect abolitionism from the sectional struggle argue that, well, few slaves really escaped, and white abolitionists had little to do with these escapes. Some historians deny that these escape networks existed, but recent studies of the Underground Railroad confirm the escape networks were real and interracial. Most important, pro-slavery leaders in the border South insisted throughout the period that the number of escapes was substantial and increasing. The escapes led Southern politicians and journalists to insist that there must be a new, stronger fugitive slave law as part of what became the Compromise of 1850. The new fugitive slave law relied on United States Marshals to help capture alleged escapees. The new law produced more violence and angered many Northerners. It made Northerners more willing to support anti-slavery candidates for office and to oppose efforts to conciliate slaveholders. Meanwhile, increasing escapes convinced the lower South, the fire eaters, that slavery was falling apart in the border South. Fire eaters came to believe they had to take drastic action to prevent this threat from moving southward toward them, sort of like an early domino theory. The war between Free State and pro-slavery forces that broke out in Kansas Territory in 1855 is widely regarded as a precursor of the Civil War. Most historians of the Civil War era cling to an interpretation that regards this violent conflict as an extension of political maneuvering between pro-slavery and anti-slavery congressmen in Washington, D.C. But in fact, slave escapes from Missouri and abolitionist encouragement of the escapees led to what became known as Bleeding Kansas. Missouri slaveholders had for years complained that abolitionists helped slaves escape eastward into Illinois and northward into Iowa. The prospect that slaves might also be able to escape westward led white Missourians to fight in Kansas, to make it a slave state. And during the Kansas struggle, John Brown emerged as a violent abolitionist. Several recent studies of Brown portray him as a transcendent figure, only tangentially connected to abolitionists. But this was not the case. These historians err in assuming that Brown was the only white abolitionist who used physical means against slavery. In fact, a long abolitionist engagement in going into the South to help slaves escape inspired Brown. Even if we discount Brown's abolitionist roots, abolitionists influenced the course of events leading to the Harper's Ferry raid by paying for Brown's effort there. A few historians go so far as to claim that Lincoln's election to the presidency in 1860 alone caused the Civil War. But even they must admit that John Brown's raid intensified Southern white commitment to secede from the Union if Lincoln were elected. So, abolitionists shaped many attitudes and events that led to the outbreak of war in April 1861. This does not mean that we have to go back to Rhodes' view that William Lloyd Garrison, as a great man in history, set in motion a transformation of Northern opinion that led to war. Abolitionism went well beyond Garrison. It constituted a much more diverse movement than Rhodes and his successors realized. Abolitionism involved a great deal more than agitation in the North. It extended well beyond members of abolition societies. It included black and white Northerners who never joined the societies but helped slaves escape and resisted those who sought to recapture escaped slaves. It included white abolitionists in the border South who frightened slavery's defenders there and in the lower South. It involved slaves who rebelled and escaped. There were also those who petitioned, lobbied, and otherwise influenced anti-slavery politics. The causes of an event as great, brutal, and transformative as the Civil War are always complex. And it's healthy to debate the significance of one cause versus another cause. But obviously, I think it's a mistake for historians to deny the important role of slavery's most radical opponents in bringing on the war. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan.
You're welcome.
Questions? Yeah. By the way, this is Professor Freeling. Freeling. Professor Freeling, who teaches. We teach the course together, the humanities course together. So, any questions? Any errors? All of this is all his fault.
That lets me off the hook.
Just curious as to whether the image or the rhetoric of the Haitian Revolution worked on either side of the abolition line.
Oh, yeah.
Abolitionists used it to threaten the South and stuff?
Yes, they did. And the Haitian Revolution was had a direct impact on Denmark Vesey. In fact, he was hoping to get to Haiti. That's where his conspiracy was to take control of Charleston, use Charleston Harbor to take ships, and then bring as many slaves to Haiti as he could. But we're learning more and more about, Gabriel back in 1800 was influenced by the Haitian Revolution. And the rhetoric on both sides. White Southerners feared Haiti. They said, we cannot weaken slavery because it'll lead to something like happened in Haiti where the slaves rose up and killed their masters. And a lot of the rhetoric of William Lloyd Garrison and other abolitionists was, well, we're trying to avoid something like this. If you want to avoid another Haiti in the South, well, free your slaves. Then they won't have a reason to revolt. White Southerners, though, believed that there was a basic racial conflict, and if they freed their slaves, the chance that black people would rise up against them would be even more likely.
Yes, thank you for the talk. Two things. I'm curious to what extent within those 4 or 5 bullet points that you identified at the end of these areas of revisiting and growing facets of research in abolitionism, how you would sort of situate, and this is related to this question, Atlantic abolitionism, right? I mean, not only the Anglo connections with Britain, but also the repercussions of what's going on in the Caribbean, also after the Civil War, right? I mean, sort of think about U.S. abolitionism vis-a-vis Spain/Cuba, vis-a-vis Brazil. as an area of research, and that may or may not reinforce what you were telling us.
Yeah.
And also, the second question, if you can historicize for us the forms and tactics of mobilization utilized by abolitionist societies, that is, which one, what was new about the practice of politics, of popular politics through the abolitionist movement? You mentioned this postal campaign. If this movement coincides with or gives birth to larger, different shapes of practicing politics.
Okay, in regard to abolitionism in the Atlantic world, I mentioned it briefly at the beginning as representing forces that, since it's so widespread, that it's more than a personal movement or a movement related to just the United States. But after listening to you ask the question, I'd say my answer is I probably should have put more emphasis on that later on, that wider context. But I didn't. But if I do ever give this paper again, I promise I will put it in there. As to what's new, and I hope I'm reconfiguring your question correctly, I'd say a lot of it isn't new. That the petitioning, Quaker abolitionists were petitioning colonial governments in the early 1700s. And they were following that up by lobbying these colonial legislatures. So the petitioning campaign is old. I think it was a tactic that changed over time. A lot of historians would say that petitioning was largely an effort to arouse Northern public opinion. In other words, it wasn't so useful being used to influence Congress as it was to spread the message, you know, here, please sign this petition, and the person would ask, well, what is this about? And they would become more of an abolitionist. The postal campaign, I'd say, was new. This was a massive effort. Abolitionists had sent propaganda into the South before, but nothing on this scale. It was just gigantic. And all of it was sent to slaveholders. But slaveholders said, oh no, this is going to get into the hands of the slaves. And even though most slaves were illiterate, they would find somebody to read it to them, and this would cause slave revolt. Another new tactic, too, of course, is the Liberty Party. Until 1840, abolitionists were going to influence the Whig Party or the Democratic Party, but now they're going to go directly into politics themselves. Yes?
Could you give an estimate of the fraction of Northerners that were abolitionists or sympathetic to it, or the fraction that were indifferent, and the fraction that were anti? Ditto for the South?
Yeah. Anti is the easiest, overwhelmingly in the 1820s, 1830s, and even into the 1840s. It was still dangerous to be an abolitionist in the 1840s and even into the early 1850s. Yes. Frederick Douglass, Garrison himself, risked their lives talking against slavery. Percentage of abolitionists, I don't think it was ever more than about 5% who were out and out abolitionists. Anti-slavery politics, people who supported anti-slavery politics rose tremendously in the late 1840s when the Free Soil Party went into action. And mostly this would follow along with the idea that this is to a large degree a selfish movement. They were mostly opposed to the expansion of slavery. And I'd say by the 1858, with Kansas and with the proposal to admit Kansas as a slaveholding state, over 50% of the population was anti-slavery in the North, because they're going to elect Lincoln in 1860. I hope that helps.
It's a hard question to
interesting distinction about the abolitionists sort of as a radical movement were able to really polarize their opponent in the Deep South, but actually retain the border slave states.
Right.
And so were there a number of different tactics they used in different locations? Was it an organized thought that they needed the border, but they could kind of radicalize their opponent farther away?
Yes. This is the major theme of this book. Border struggle between...
Did you set him this question?
I sort of paged through the front parts of the book, and so then I was wondering, when you boil it down,
There was a struggle between the border south and the lower north, focused mainly on escaping slaves. The lower north helping the slaves escape, the border south trying to keep them from escaping, and also pursuing them into the lower north and angering lower northerners because of the violence involved. And my thesis in border war is that by the late 1850s, the lower north had won the border war. And white border southerners are fearful that slavery is going to totally unravel. And they have to make a decision. Which is going to be better to protect slavery in Kentucky and Virginia and Maryland and Missouri? To secede from the Union, as the lower South is urging them to do, or stick with the Union, and even Abraham Lincoln's government is promising them to help to enforce the Fugitive Slave Law. So which is it going to be? And some people are saying, well, so long as we are in the Union, we're going to have U.S. government support for recapturing our slaves. If we pull out of the Union, it's going to, that support is going to end. If we're separate countries.
is it a conscious or subconscious decision in the popular vote that once the border states had turned to the north, the war could begin? Because at that point, both the political electing of Lincoln was possible, and in fact, the southern states were now stacked against and already split. Had they split their own?
I don't think that was a conscious decision. Because Lincoln certainly wasn't sure that he was going to hang on to the border states. A lot of his more conservative policies in early 1861, promising to enforce the Fugitive Slave Law, hesitance to confront secession in the lower South. He's constantly thinking, if I go, and his reluctance early on to talk about abolishing slavery. All these things were because he was still fearful that he could lose the border slave states unless he was very, very careful.
But maybe 10 years ago, before that, the border slave states would have certainly gone with the South.
No, I don't think so, because they were the main supporters of the Compromise of 1850. And for precisely the same reason. They wanted that stronger Fugitive Slave Law because they thought that would be the best protection for slavery in their region.
Let me give you the last one. Go ahead.
Just it's kind of a more general question is, what do you see as the relationship or the crossover between the long-term goal of abolishing slavery, which the abolitionists had been pushing, and the short-term goal of ending a rebellion in the South as a short-term military and political goal?
When the war started, it was the war to save the Union, not to abolish slavery. And Lincoln made this clear, although the radical wing of his party and the abolitionists, Frederick Douglass in particular, saying this war should be a war to end slavery as well as save the Union. And it wasn't until mid-1862 that Lincoln began to see that making the goal of abolishing slavery would help not hurt, saving the Union. And he was already drafting his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation at that time. And of course, he couldn't do it after a series of Northern defeats, and he waited until after the sort of victory at Antietam to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And then from then on, the goal of the Lincoln administration is both to save the Union and to abolish slavery. Is that?
Yeah.
I didn't realize you had a question, so you got it.
It's also a very general question. Could you say something about the documents or sources, or maybe shift in focus that inspired or maybe even required the re-evaluation of the role of the abolitionist movement that you were describing?
I think the key to the reevaluation is the more in-depth investigation of African Americans in relationship to the abolitionist movement. That for years, abolitionists were first ignored. I mean, African American abolitionists were first ignored. And then, starting in the 1960s, when people started paying more attention to them, they assumed that there was a conflict between white abolitionists and black abolitionists. They didn't really work very well together. White abolitionists, historians spent a lot of time finding that white abolitionists were racist, just like everybody else, that they couldn't work very well with African American abolitionists. It seems like it's been in the 80s where historians started seeing black abolitionists as a positive influence on white abolitionists. And I think there is where we start Jim Houston's article on the abolitionism not being rooted in psychology or religion. Instead, it was based on what he called experiential basis for abolitionism, that is based on an interaction between white abolitionists and African Americans. And I think with that, we start broadening the whole idea. And about the same time, Doug Edgerton is writing about Denmark, well, first Gabriel and then Denmark Vesey, and showing that, they're not just thoughtless reactors against slavery, that they have an intellectual framework that they're working in as well, that they are abolitionists. And as a result, we broaden the base. And I think that's the key to understanding us. And of course, the other thing too, understanding that men like Cassius Clay in the borderland in Kentucky, even though they're conservative by northern abolitionist standards, are really abolitionists. They're serious and they have a real impact.
Okay, well, most probably we could stand by quoting that Lincoln's comment on first meeting Harriet Beecher Stowe. The little woman
Who
that
started the big war. Yes.
Thank you, Stan.
Thank you, and thanks for the good questions.
And thank you for coming and remind